At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
School choice, rural hospitals, voter access. The 2026 Mississippi Legislature will impact you and your family for years to come. MPB brings you At Issue, a weekly analysis of the legislative session and the issues affecting you with perspectives from both sides of the aisle. Brandon Jones and new At Issue analyst Rebecca Staples join me, Wilson Stribling, every Monday at 5 p.m. only on MPB Think Radio and wherever you get your podcasts. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
This is Deep South Dining on MPB Think Radio. Good morning. Carol Palmer, Malcolm White. Carol, how are you this morning?
Malcolm, I'm great.
That
how
is
are
terrific.
you? I'm getting ready.
I'm in a good way, as it were. Today on our show, we have New York Times food correspondent based in New Orleans. He is a friend of the show who writes about restaurants that tell us about the world and are worth visiting, even if they're far away from where we live. Please welcome to our show our friend, Brent Anderson. Hello, Brent.
Hey, you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and he's not only the New York Times food writer, but we've known Brett at many stages of his career, and now you're fully grown up. After 20-something years of doing work, grown up, and wow, what a ride it's been. I think we all got to meet for the first time at Southern Foodways. That was a little while ago.
It was a little while ago. In fact, I know I moved to New Orleans. I moved to New Orleans to become the restaurant critic at the Times-Picayune. And my first day of work was 25 years and 1 day ago today.
Wow.
This is December 11th. We're recording this, and I always remember my first day of work was December 10th. And I think I might have met you both. I went to the Southern Foodways Alliance in the fall of the conference in Oxford, Mississippi, in the fall of 2001 was the first time I went. It was just after 9/11, in fact.
Oh, okay.
But if I didn't meet you guys that year, it was the year after. Huh?
Yeah. I said, yes, we would have been there. We were there, and you may remember one of Malcolm's famous presentations of the Biloxi pressed po' boy, where he took an ironing board on the stage of the Southern Foodways Alliance and pressed a po' boy.
With an iron.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
And here I am.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So we go back.
So how did you get to the Times-Picayune? I mean, you're a native Minnesotan, right?
Yes. I started in journalism quite young as a music columnist at a weekly newspaper in Minneapolis. I had gone to college briefly in Iowa, and it didn't go well. And I came home and to Minneapolis, and I moved in with my sister, and a woman who was one of our roommates, who we both knew, were friends with, was working at a weekly newspaper, and she had to give like less than 2 weeks notice that she was quitting her job because she was a nurse, and she got this great opportunity at a hospital that she had to kind of rush to. And it was just an entry level kind of, in those days, Xeroxing job, but I was a big music fan, and all I ever really wanted to do was write about rock and roll, and that job evolved sort of quickly into a writing job. And I followed the editor that hired me in Minneapolis to Washington, D.C. in the mid 90s. And that's where I started writing about restaurants. I had, I was 25 when I started doing that. And I did it for a weekly newspaper in Washington, D.C. called the Washington City Paper, which is still around. I wrote a column called Young and Hungry. That was, sort of, I wrote kind of about at that time, I was open about my kind of culinary education in a way. And that area was like a really good place for me in retrospect, in particular, to kind of cut my teeth as both a food writer and a journalist writ large. DC is filled with journalists. It's an interesting town to be a young writer. And in those days, there wasn't, it was easy to learn on the job because there wasn't that much competition, to be honest. DC,
that was a small world back then.
It was, yeah. It was like there's two things happening. Is that the food media hadn't exploded yet. The food channel barely existed, right? The idea
early
of a celebrity
days.
chef. Yeah, it was early days. I mean, it was, the internet barely was a thing. I mean, and people in food journalism back then, I know this. I used to go to conferences when I was in my early 20s, mid 20s, and I was sort of this novelty as a young person who was also male in those days, where all these daily newspapers, they had food sections that tended to be run by women, and, which had to do with some historical sexism, among other things.
Luncheons and teas. And, it came out of the women's section, the women's page.
Yeah. How do you think Craig Claiborne felt?
Yeah, I mean, he was an interesting figure in that regard. But so that was a really interesting time. I mean, for me, and I feel lucky that I got to be able to kind of like educate myself in public without being sort of like torn down.
Well, I did not know
today.
Before that the name of the column was Young and Hungry. I mean, I knew that you had been in Washington, but what a great little area to start with, because you don't have to know anything when you're young and hungry. I mean, you can actually discover, through your journalism, you're discovering food. You're not having to act as the ultimate authority. You're acting as someone experiencing the food.
That was sort of the idea, and it was my editor came up with the name, but it was really good cover. My editor was David Carr, who was a brilliant editor, and he was the one that had the idea that I start to write about food, and DC was also, particularly compared to where I came from, the Minnesota, the upper Midwest in the 80s and 90s was not diverse, and the DC area, it remains true. It was filled with all the Salvadoran restaurants and Korean places, and really good Spanish and Japanese, and a lot of really good stuff, and it was a really great place to kind of cut my teeth, as I said. But I didn't think I would stay writing about food. I mean, that job was like about 30% of what my responsibility was. I was also writing, sort of news stories and other kinds of features, and still writing a lot about music. And I just turned into, I never got sick of it, and it became to my surprise, to be honest. And it became my professional identity. And then I got a call one day, in 2000 from an editor here in New Orleans asking if I wanted to apply for this restaurant critic job. And I came down, and, I almost didn't take it. It wasn't as easy of a decision as it frankly should have been. You know what I mean? Like a no-brainer for me. I'm kind of criticizing myself there, but I had really wanted to move to New York to be a magazine writer or something like that. That's sort of what I wanted to do. When you live on the East Coast as a journalist, there is this I've experienced this. That, if you're living anywhere else is sort of not in the game. That's of course completely untrue, but I feared it. I feared that I wouldn't have a rewarding career if I didn't go to New York for some reason. But then I came to my senses and decided I would give New Orleans a try. And, I was in that job for almost 20 years. And,
New Orleans loved you, Brett, from the start. I mean, music
Some
and
people
food. What a great, how much better could it get?
It's a good personal match. I like it here very much.
Well, I was blessed at 24 to move to New Orleans and run the Bourbon Orleans Hotel in the Quarter. And at that time, Richard Collin was the food editor, the critic, and I don't really know, maybe you do, there was this underground gourmet, I guess, franchise that he occupied and then published, dining guides under the underground gourmet heading, but also wrote in the Times-Picayune and published a multitude of cookbooks, one of which I think is a classic, the New Orleans cookbook. But anyway, I didn't know if you ever ran into him or remember his legacy.
Well, I never met him. I believe he moved out of town by the time I got here. But his books were sort of required reading in my education, and knowing about his, what he'd done here. And so I can still see the spine of his books on my shelf at the Times-Picayune in my cubicle, but I didn't meet him, the critic who had been here and had the most sort of immediate legacy among my predecessors, who I befriended and learned a lot from, was a guy named Gene Borg.
Oh, yes.
And he had been the critic at the Picayune, and he had been a longtime writer at the Picayune prior to that. And I believe Gene was originally from Cajun country, but he was very much a creature of the French Quarter when I met him and whatnot. He recently died, sadly, but I learned a lot from him about New Orleans and about being a newspaper guy down here, and I'm really grateful to him for that.
And after him, was it Tom Fitzmaurice? Do I have that name right?
Tom Fitzmaurice was very much a presence when I moved to town, and he also recently passed, sadly. But he had never worked for the Picayune. He was sort of the, he built a really big platform for himself and was a really consequential food writer here and restaurant presence. But he worked for, I believe throughout his career, almost every publication but the Times-Picayune, and had a very popular radio show, a drive time radio show when I moved to town that was all about food. Yeah, and that was really that told me a lot about the centrality of restaurants and food in the culture of New Orleans, was the fact that when drive time radio was still very much a dominant form, he had a drive time show. Was just people calling in talking about po' boys and stuff. I mean, it was amazing. It
was great.
So you're a guy from Minnesota, right up the river, a few hundreds of miles. You're growing up in a Midwestern cuisine, and here you come down the river to New Orleans. Where did you start? How did you dig into the food scene?
Well, that's a good question. We talked a little bit about that job I had in Washington, D.C., and I bring that up because I was, as a journalist, already conditioned and accustomed to trying to be as honest and transparent with my audience about what I did and didn't know. And I kind of took that approach in New Orleans. I had a lot of sort of youthful confidence about, my ability to determine what I thought a good restaurant was and wasn't, and to communicate that with some effectiveness. But I also tried to be clear-eyed as I could be that I was going to be experiencing a learning curve, and I would try to write that You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
write about first experiences, right? And that kind of thing. It's been so long ago. I'm trying to think of an actual example of it. I remember writing about my first Mardi Gras and going to all the Mardi Gras parties, and everyone's got Popeye's chicken, and like these sort of rites of passage that I would, write about. I wrote about going to Galatoire's for the first time, in one story, and that was part of my journalistic approach, was to be open with readers about who I was, what my background was, and what I was trying to do here in New Orleans. But at the same time, I was reading quite voraciously, eating out itself, right? I mean, that's reporting as a particularly as a restaurant critic, and I was younger and didn't have kids. I mean, I was eating out for probably 15 years. I ate out 8 to 10 times a week,
Yeah.
and you learn a lot when you do that, and also, going to Mississippi to go to the Southern Foodways Alliance conferences every year was my one real sort of professional development excursion. And I felt that was really important. Like I remember at the Picayune, they would pay for one thing, like one conference.
Right.
And that's the one, there's a lot of things I could have gone to as a food journalist, but that's what I picked. Cause I just felt like my having grown up in such a culturally different part of the country was my biggest job to compensate. That was the thing I was going to have to compensate for the most. And I have to say, I think that that instinct was correct of in retrospect. I think in the moment that instinct was correct, it was the right thing to believe about what I needed to do for my self-education. But in retrospect, I do actually think there are so many more similarities between where I grew up in the northern Midwest and the communities of the Deep South than people realize.
Yeah. Well, and for you, the river must have been a connector, having grown up in Minnesota, ended up in New Orleans. I mean,
and my mom is actually from right near Lake Itasca, which is the source.
Headwaters, yeah.
Yeah, so I used to grow up, visiting my grandparents and, jumping across the
river, which I've done up there. And it's like, wow, look how small it is.
It's cool.
We'll be right back with more of our interview with New York Times food correspondent Brett Anderson.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Rush. As a blues man, I love Mississippi Public Broadcasting. If you support Mississippi music and their local programming, donate now, right now, and become a member today, not tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Doesn't matter how big or small, but we prefer big. Thank you very much.
School choice, rural hospitals, voter access. The 2026 Mississippi Legislature will impact you and your family for years to come. MPB brings you At Issue, a weekly analysis of the legislative session and the issues affecting you with perspectives from both sides of the aisle. Brandon Jones and new At Issue analyst Rebecca Staples join me, Wilson Stribling, every Monday at 5 p.m. only on MPB Think Radio and wherever you get your podcasts. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, is a brand new companion podcast to the MPB documentary Everlasting, the life and legacy of Medgar Evers. Join me, Rita Brent, as we dive deeper into the story with exclusive interviews and conversations about the enduring legacy of Medgar Evers. Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, available on the MPB app or wherever you get your podcasts, with new episodes every other week. MPB, your stories, our mission.
You were in New Orleans during Katrina, and I think you were part of the staff that won a Pulitzer Prize for public service, and I think it was 2006 for the work in Katrina. Talk to us a little bit about your piece of that as you were a food writer.
Well, there's an interesting Mississippi connection again. I evacuated on the August 29th, the day of the hurricane, and went to Oxford. evacuated with a friend of mine, Cynthia Joyce, who lived in New Orleans and is now a professor at Ole Miss, as it happens. Um, and kind of hoping I'd come back soon, And in fact, the day before I left, the Saturday before I, drove out, I was kind of, boarding up the house, and I had this feeling, I don't, this is kind of feeling a little grim, and like I want to go out one more time,
Yeah.
And I've been starting to feel that sort of like, oh, like this is getting kind of serious, And I remember my first instinct was, well, I should go to this place that I'm reviewing, in the middle of reviewing, because then that'll be my last visit. And if I have to if I have to make deadline on Monday morning, or Tuesday morning or whatever it is, I'll have done all my visits, and that's kind of what I hoped would happen. But that place was closed, and I began calling around town, to find a place that was open, and places were closed, and I started to get kind of frantic, to find a place open, and ended up calling Clancy's, which is a great French Creole place uptown, and not only was it open, it was sort of like, and this is a restaurant that, in those days, restaurants answered their phones, but it was like they couldn't hear me. You know what I'm saying? I was like, hey, are you open? And they're like, excuse me, hello, Clancy's? And I was like, perfect. And so I went up there for dinner with a couple of friends, Cynthia and Keith Spira, who's a music critic here. And then left the next day. And then, what happened. And I came back into New Orleans, like I think it was the Friday, the storm kind of hit on a Sunday and manifested itself on a Monday, and was back in town on Friday. And, and I worked as just a regular reporter for what at the time felt like a month. But when I've gone back to look at the clips, which I had an occasion to do because we just had the 20th anniversary, it was really like a week, of, the first story I wrote was, I ran into, I came in, there was just a handful of, well, maybe a half dozen to 8 reporters for the Picayune that had stayed in the city. And by the time I got here, they were going out to relieve themselves. They'd been traumatized. Right. And so that first morning I reported, it was just me and Jeff Duncan, who's a sports columnist, who were the only writers here that day. Everyone else was like fried. And there was fires, in the city, which was weird, right? Like it's 80% underwater. And the story of the day was there's fires, and we'd go to, all the reporters at the beginning of the day would go to this press conference with like the police chief and the health commissioner, the
National
governor,
Guard.
even sometimes that, would be kind of telling you what was going on. And, some days you'd get in the back of a military vehicle to go into the floods and all that kind of stuff. But that first day, I remember Jeff, I think, went and wrote about the fires, and I went and wrote a story about there was police officers who had been committing suicide. And that was like the first story I wrote. And then, for days after, I just helped out with writing about what it was like in the city. And at that time, I very much 100% believed that I would, stay around and try to fill the paper and help in whatever way I could for a while, and then probably write a series of stories about, these great restaurants that never reopened. And then the newspaper would fold and I'd move somewhere else. That's what I thought would happen, because it was incomprehensible. It wasn't imaginable to me.
Right.
That the city could return to something like normal. It just didn't seem like that was possible. And to come down and actually be a reporter here, then to think otherwise would have meant you were like not facing reality in some ways, right? It was such a dystopian scene. But then it sort of became clear in not, within a couple of weeks that if the city was going to get back, that restaurant culture and food culture would be a big part of how it came back. And, the best way I can describe it is that within the first month or so, maybe 5-6 weeks, you started to see, despite this devastation, despite the fact that, 80% of the city had been underwater and that you could drive for blocks and blocks and blocks through neighborhoods that would normally be filled with people and life and traffic, and it would be just dark and musty and destroyed. There were little nodes where you pull up and some restaurateur had figured out how to, they'd found their shrimp guy. And you'd walk inside and it would be joyous. People
Right.
were drinking wine and having a great time and it just became clear that restaurateurs and chefs and restaurant professionals were going to be showing the rest of the world and certainly the citizens of New Orleans that it is possible, to bring things back and we're going to show you,
Right.
and then it also became this reminder that of how fun it was, how great it was, and that this is something worth trying to reach for and to restore and to reinvigorate. And I basically wrote about that in all its different manifestations for nearly 3 years. I didn't write a restaurant review for 3 years.
Wow.
Wow. What was the time frame? You did a wonderful oral history of Paul Prudhomme that won a James Beard Award. Was that around that time?
That came out just before Hurricane Katrina. I had that, that you ask about how I educated myself too about New Orleans. One of the things I did is I spent almost a year interviewing Paul Prudhomme. And he, just for your readers who maybe don't know who he is, Paul Prudhomme was this Cajun chef who became really, I would argue, America's first sort of restaurant celebrity chef. Him and Wolfgang Puck, of real note, and also is the person most responsible for bringing Cajun food into New Orleans. That was not something that was normal.
Yeah, and black and red fish was his dish that everybody knows.
Yeah, the world is adopted. And but when I got to New Orleans in 2000, he was like kind of not his restaurant, K. Paul's Louisiana Kitchen, and it was like he wasn't really part of the conversation. He certainly wasn't part of the conversation nationally, and I feel like that was a something that was where my kind of fresh eyes and like outsider naivete was an asset. Where I told my editors, I'm like, this guy in the French Quarter, like, a lot of people kind of had dismissed it as a tourist trap or something. I'm like, this guy like invented modern culture,
Right.
and his legacy is really, really huge and important and vast. And I spent all this time like testing that theory out by interviewing Paul and everyone I could find around him, and to create this sort of oral history about the legacy of Chef Paul and K. Paul's Louisiana Kitchen. And that was, I worked on that on and off, I think probably for a year and a half or something like that. But it came out just like, I think July, and the Katrina hit in August of 2005.
I saw like last week there was a dedication of his the real estate that was K. Paul's has been sort of named for him, and it's become a part of the historic New Orleans
New Orleans collection. Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
Which is a historical organization in the French Quarter that's doing really good work and is prosperous, and they bought that building and that space and renamed it after him. It's not a restaurant, but
right.
It's nice that they're honoring that and that it is staying, in sort of a semi-public form.
And I noticed that they took his old menu box. I don't know what you call those, where he used to place his
like
menus.
the billboard.
Oh, like on the outside?
Yeah, and replaced it with a sort of historical marker document, which was really cool.
Oh, I have not walked by yet. I don't live where I'm sitting right now is not far from there, but I've been ill.
Right.
That's all new. So I haven't walked by to see that. I'll go do that with my boys.
Well, that was just, a great thing you did with that interview for all of us, to really preserve his legacy, because I feel the same way. I mean, he started it all, and I think in the end he never really got the credit he deserved for the just tremendous contribution he made to food in America. I mean, he was the first chef that did what we now call pop-ups. They would do a Paul Prudhomme pop-up in San Francisco, or whatever they called it then, or I think even did one in
had
Russia.
a sort of multimedia career too.
Yeah.
I mean, that was not normal
show.
before him. But yeah, no, you're right, Carol. He was so influential and such a kind of a visionary guy. And I'm sad that the restaurant couldn't last, but that often happens.
Right.
Yeah, it can't outlast its founder.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. You wear a lot of hats, especially with the time you're talking about doing an oral history, and then you're a food writer writing about food, and then you are a restaurant critic. So those are all very different responsibilities. And how is it to be a restaurant critic in New Orleans? I mean, there's not much anonymity, I would think. And I'd just like for our listeners to know a little bit. They think just a restaurant critic goes to a restaurant and eats and writes about it. And tell us a little bit about the process.
Well, the process at the Picayune in that job, and I did that for 19 years, it evolved over time, I would say. It was an unusual tenure, largely because of Hurricane Katrina, and then later the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, and the fact that I'm also a reporter and had a lot of reporting responsibilities. Sometimes those would overtake the restaurant critic responsibilities, particularly in these heavy moments. But that said, the restaurant critic job I did in much the same way that, I know that my colleagues at the New York Times and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Post and, and all of these big newspapers across the country still do the job, which is to, you eat at the restaurant multiple times. 3 is sort of the industry standard as a minimum amount of times. And you try to make your visits to stagger them as much as you can over a period of time to kind of get a sense of how the restaurant operates over a period of time. And then also to get to eat about as much of the menu as you can, and every meal that I would go to, almost every meal I would go to at a restaurant, I go with, between 1 and 3 other people. Occasionally I would do a solo bar visit, but that allows you to kind of get a feel for the restaurant, about how other people dine at it. And, in the early years of the Picayune, this is pre-social media, remember, I was very careful about, I had credit cards that had fake names on them. I would always get reservations in other people's names. My picture wasn't in the paper. I never introduced myself to anyone. I would, I had this sort of rule that I never broke the fourth wall, like if someone, if a restaurant owner came to my table and was like, "Hey, Brett, how was your meal?" I wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm not Brett." I didn't do that. And I never wore disguises,
Like Ruth Rachel, you mean you didn't have any wigs?
I didn't have, it's, I think, a little harder for a guy. and also it just like I had considered it, because people would always ask. And this was just after Ruth Reichel had left the Times, so it was this idea that critics ought to be in disguise was very much accepted as something that, of course, that's what you would do. But I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, to really get it to fool people, you'd be in makeup all day, every day. You know what I mean? Like you'd need your own costume person or whatever, it's just, it was completely unreasonable. So I never did that.
And also, if anybody in any restaurant in New Orleans heard you laugh, they would know it was you.
I mean, I have to say that's the thing I started to realize that was something that people started to out me for, and I wasn't really conscious of that. But I mean, I think I enjoyed partial anonymity most of the places I ate up until about 3.5 up until Katrina, But then even after that, I would still never get restaurant reservations in my own name. The idea is you don't want to give the restaurant a heads up, so that they can prepare to treat you better than other people, right? And which seems fair, and and there's restaurants in New Orleans are kind of used to the press.
Sure.
So, and after having been here a while, the whole spectacle of like, oh, we got to like bow down in front of the critic, that just didn't, it didn't seem to be much of a factor for me. It is a small town. People know what I look like. I think they kind of know that I don't want you to send out all sorts of free food and, just because it's like I want to order what I want to order.
Right.
Well, it's interesting to talk about because I think there's not a lot of understanding about the ethics of being a restaurant critic. The ethics that the places that you've mentioned, the New York Times, have. I mean, it would be better for all of us if everyone shared that same set of rules.
We'll be right back with more of our interview with New York Times food correspondent Brett Anderson.
The Measuring Show.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, is a brand new companion podcast to the MPB documentary Everlasting, the life and legacy of Medgar Evers. Join me, Rita Brent, as we dive deeper into the story with exclusive interviews and conversations about the enduring legacy of Medgar Evers. Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, available on the MPB app or wherever you get your podcasts, with new episodes every other week. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Before we get you from the Times-Picayune to the New York Times, I observed that you were once a music critic, a music writer. It was probably your first love, as you shared. And I noticed just yesterday, or the day before, the announcement of the Jazz Fest lineup. Big announcement every year. Those of us who love the Jazz Fest look forward to it. And when I think of the Jazz Fest, I always think of Dr. John. So I would like for you to share with us the meal of raccoon that you took with the good Dr. John in your life.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. It was like kind of...
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, how did I describe? I think I said he talked like a beatnik bullfrog with a speech impediment. Which is, I thought that was a good line. Dr. John, this great New Orleans pianist and guitar player and composer and singer and performer and who near the end of his life, I had been talking with some of his people in his orbit, including a chef named Tenny Flynn, who's one of the founders and chef of G.W. Finn's in the French Quarter. Great place and a good guy. And he and Mac, as Dr. John's real name is,
Malcolm Mac Rebenek.
Mac Rebenek, had become friendly. And one of the reasons they became friendly was that Mac really likes game. and sort of unusual game. And he had this theory that it was he thinks it's delicious, but also just healthier. That if you get food from the wild, forage stuff, it'd be healthier. And he was open about this. He was a drug addict for a lot of his life, and later in life wanted to be healthier. Right. And Tenny Flynn would whenever he could get his hands on raccoon, he would stash it, put it in his freezer, because he knew that Dr. John would want some, and for quite a while, Tenny and I were back and forth. I'm like, well, I want to come eat some raccoon with Dr. John.
Who wouldn't?
And it was, I think, in the fall of 2019, maybe something like that. I met him over on the North Shore at this little house on the river up there. I forget the name of the Chifuncta, maybe. Mm-hmm. And Tenny made this spread of different coon preparations. I think there was like kind of a smoked barbecue one.
Yeah. Multiple.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like there's a braised one and a smoked one, and I forget exactly what the preparations were now because it was like 7-8 years ago. But and there was one that we all agreed was merely edible, and some of the others were actually quite a bit better than you would think. But it was a great pleasure. I mean, I love Dr. John, and he was, as you might imagine, meeting in the mid-afternoon, he had just woken up.
Barely.
And it's sort of it. I was there 2 hours before he really started to lock in conversation.
Well, the coon had to kick in.
Yeah, and he, I remember there was at one point, I remember writing that story and kind of looking through my notes and realizing, that I'd asked him a question at like 3:30 in the afternoon, and then the answer came up at like 5. Just like,
well, he had to marinate on it.
Yeah. In the middle of another conversation. But it was great to hear him talk and literally hear him talk because he had such an amazing voice, but also hear what he had to say about his life and how he loved New Orleans food. And was known to go to lots of restaurants and stuff. He go to Brightson's, I know, with some regularity. I remember a waiter at Brightson's once, I think I was in Brightson's one time, 20 years ago, a day or two after Mac had been in there. And
they were still talking about it.
And they were still talking about it. And the waiter had said that, that Mac had gotten the sweetbreads, and that he had told the waiter, he said, "Those sweetbreads kicked me to the dirt." Which I thought was kind of a cool way to say that I liked a dish.
Mac was very urbane for a country boy.
Yeah. But yeah, that was one of my kind of the later pieces I did for the Times-Picayune. I always feel lucky to have gotten to meet him and eat with him.
So let's move on to the New York Times. How'd you get there?
How did I get there? Well, the Picayune got bought and everyone got laid off.
There's that.
It was the real impetus. I had been freelancing for the food section of the New York Times, and the Picayune got purchased, and within one day, everyone got laid off. And the editor of the food section at the time, Sam Sifton, is someone I'd known, and he was sort of one of my editors there as a freelancer. Had reached out about writing for them, and that's how it happened. I mean, it was like there was a little more to it, but we came up with a job that allowed me to stay in New Orleans because my wife owns a business here. Like, moving to New York wasn't really a possibility for me, and we have young kids, and so we just came up with a staff job that works for me and for the Times. And I've been doing it for, over 6 years now. And I started writing primarily, what I call enterprise features, which are, sort of longer, deeply reported newspaper stories, basically magazine stories, but written short enough to go to the newspaper is the way I would put it, about chefs and food culture around the country, with the focus on going to places that the Times food section historically hadn't gotten to a lot, places in the Midwest and the Deep South and that kind of thing. But having only been at the Times for 6 years, things have really changed there. And if you're a reporter and you work there, it's really been for the better. I mean, and I would say if you're a journalist or a reader or a citizen, it's been for the better too. But the Times has really grown,
Yes.
and particularly its food section. I mean, the staff, the number of people I work with has way more than doubled. Or I think probably tripled since I started. We have a cooking department and an app that people pay for that's really, really sophisticated and really good.
The app is incredible. I mean, it is so robust and new things every day. You can take it to the bank. They are well tested.
It's tested. I use it all the time. I used it all the time before I got there. But my job has evolved. I still write features. I also do investigations on occasion. And I do a fair bit of service journalism. About 3 years ago, for the first time, the Times started, our staff started putting out a 50 best restaurants in the country list in the fall. And the Times had never done anything like that before. And, one of my responsibilities is I do, I do more traveling than anyone else for that, where I go to lots of different regions that are part of my regions across the country to scout. And while I'm doing that scouting, I'm also reporting other stories wherever I can. And we also started doing city guides, the best places to eat in Nashville and Austin, Texas, and Miami and Washington, D.C. And I contribute to those as well. And so I do spend a fair bit of my time, doing that kind of, it's sort of criticism adjacent work. I'm not a chief critic. I don't write long reviews with stars on them, but I am making some critical judgments about, what restaurants we're going to give attention to in the Times in these guides that do get kind of a lot of readership and people will use. And that was something that didn't exist when I started there.
Right.
And so that's new. And there's been a real expansion of our restaurant coverage. We have 2 chief restaurant critics now, one based in Los Angeles and another in New York City. On top of all of that work I just described. And we have 2 other freelancers in New York who are writing reviews in New York. It's part of a way to keep the reviews in New York going while Lagaya, who's the New York-based critic, does some traveling herself. And so, there's been a lot of changes, and they've all been, I feel lucky to have been a part of them. I really like working at the Times. I really like the mix of reporting and feature writing and sort of writing little 150-word celebrations of restaurants that I love, which is I do a lot of, and I still, at 30 some years into this, I still really love eating in restaurants. I couldn't do it if that wasn't the case.
We're about to wrap up, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about James Beard. You've received James Beard recognition. You've been involved with James Beard, I'm sure, for many years. How do you feel about contemporary James Beard Awards and the James Beard Foundation?
I mean, I was, for full disclosure, I was on the Restaurant Awards Committee for 10 years, from I think it's 2002 to 2012. And that was a committee that sort of administered the awards that went out to chefs and restaurants, right? So I did work there for a while, it's a volunteer thing, but I was part of that. Right. I also wrote a story for the Times 2-3 years ago about Beard, the foundation's efforts to try to, basically, I would explain it as kind of guarantee the public that they were vetting candidates and honorees for Beard Awards to ensure that they were only honoring people whose personal behavior met a certain standard.
Right.
And, that was something that came out of like the Me Too movement, right? Mm-hmm. I think an imperative that they felt that came out of the Me Too movement, and then COVID, where, we went through a period where there was a lot of people in the restaurant community who were raising their voices about workplace treatment and sort of an expansion of some of the complaints that we saw around the Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I think that in some ways the Beard Foundation, had to kind of, and the Beard Foundation had been kind of called onto the carpet for having honored restaurateurs and chefs and so forth in the past who had been found to be run workplaces where there was harassment and things like this.
Right.
And so, I feel like that's a little bit of an impossible job as someone who's done a lot of reporting about that stuff, when you try to uncover allegations of misbehavior. As a journalist, you're used to doing things that kind of make everyone not like you. That's a harder thing to do when you're an organization and an institution devoted to celebrating. And I sympathize with how difficult that is with the foundation. I also do think that they still do provide a really important role, or serve an important role in the culinary arts in the United States of, celebrating young up and coming excellence and in the culinary arts and established mastery, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. And I think they've done a good job at celebrating more diversity in the American culinary arts that they have in the past.
Yes.
And so those are my thoughts. As a Times writer, we cover the Beard Foundation, so it's a little bit of I have a different position than I used to.
Right.
And I'm not allowed to enter the awards, for instance.
Sure.
Well, you've already won
I
enough.
wish them well. I wish them well, and I'm happy for people that win them. And,
And I believe you've won 3 or 4.
I've won 3, I think.
3. Yes, you've won your awards.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time. Tell our listeners where they can find you, if they want to follow you, if you're involved in
You can
all of the above.
If you Google Brett Anderson New York Times,
are.
you will find a page that has my stories on it, and I think that's the best place to go. I mean, I am on what I still call Twitter at Brett Eats. I am not active there, but you can contact me there, and the same is true on Instagram, where you can find me as Brett E. BRETTYA. And also, if you go to New York Times, my page, there's my email address. I'm easy to find.
Carol?
Brett, we are just so grateful to have you today. It's been fun. We've been wanting to do this for a while.
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm honored to be on here, and it was great to see you guys in person at the Mayflower.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
That's where we last met. You and your family were dining in what we call the Galatoires of Jackson.
Yeah, for good reason. And we had the night before had eaten at Doe's.
Whew.
Oh, wow. Your kids got a great experience on your little vacation.
Yeah, they did. And I love the Mayflower. I mean, I love Doe's too, but the Mayflower is, I've just had 3 really great meals there in a row. And that lunch was one of them when I saw you guys.
Well, thanks so much. And we will look forward to gathering once again down the road. And we appreciate you very much.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Deep South Dining is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting Think Radio, made possible thanks to the generous support of listeners like you. For our guest, Brett Anderson, and our hosts, Malcolm White and Carol Palmer, I'm producer Marissa Vaughn, saying stay tuned for Everyday Tech at 10 and Southern Remedy at 11. And join us next Monday and Sunday at 9 for more Deep South Dining, heard only on MPB Think Radio.